Norwegian Wood is a poignant coming-of-age story that gently unravels themes of love, loss, memory, and mental illness. Set in 1960s Tokyo, it follows Toru Watanabe, a quiet and introspective college student, as he navigates the emotional complexities of young adulthood. When he reconnects with Naoko, a beautiful but emotionally fragile girl from his past, their bond deepens, haunted by the shadow of a mutual friend's death. As Toru becomes entangled in a web of delicate relationships, particularly with the vivacious and free-spirited Midori, he's forced to confront painful truths about grief, identity, and the often unbearable weight of life. The novel unfolds like a melancholy melody, intimate and deeply human, capturing the quiet turmoil of growing up and the lingering ache of memories that never quite fade. About the author. Haruki Murakami is one of Japan's most internationally acclaimed writers, known for his surreal storytelling, emotionally resonant characters, and dreamlike narratives. Born in Kyoto in 1949, he came to literature relatively late, inspired while watching a baseball game, and published his first novel, Hear the Wind Sing, in 1979. His work often blends Western pop culture, jazz, and magical realism with introspective explorations of loneliness, identity, and the subconscious. While many of his books delve into the surreal, Norwegian Wood stands out as one of his most grounded and realistic novels, earning him widespread popularity and turning him into a literary phenomenon in Japan and beyond. When Toru Watanabe heard the Beatles' song Norwegian Wood playing on a plane, he was suddenly pulled into the distant past. Memories, delicate and bittersweet, unfolded in his mind like falling petals, carrying him back to when he was just 17, wandering through a quiet, uncertain world full of longing and invisible scars. In those days, Tokyo was a city of restless students and political protests, of cassette tapes and late-night jazz. Toru was calm, quiet, and a little detached from the world, someone who preferred reading novels and walking alone to joining demonstrations or wild parties. Life had changed for him when Kazuki, his best friend since childhood, took his own life without warning. He had been 17 then, and nothing ever felt stable again. Toru couldn't make sense of it. Kazuki had always seemed cheerful, clever, full of life. But after that sudden silence, a hole opened in Toru's heart that never really closed. In the wake of Kazuki's death, Toru found himself slowly drawing closer to Naoko, Kazuki's beautiful, fragile girlfriend. She was like a drifting feather, soft-spoken, delicate, lost in her thoughts. They shared long walks through quiet neighborhoods, speaking very little, but feeling everything. Toru never tried to rush her or break the silence. Their connection was quiet but deep, bound by mutual grief and a kind of loneliness that no one else could really understand. One day, as they walked up a grassy hill together, something shifted. Naoko led him to a secluded spot, and under the weight of the setting sun, they made love not out of passion, but out of something more fragile, more haunted. The next morning she disappeared, just like that. She left behind a note and vanished from the campus, leaving Toru wondering where she'd gone and whether he had done something wrong. Time passed slowly after that. Toru drifted through college, reading endlessly, going to lectures, and wandering the city alone. He rented a small, bare room in a house with thin walls and a talkative roommate named Nagasawa. who was charming, arrogant, and always chasing women. Nagasawa had a girlfriend too, Hatsumi, gentle and kind, but waiting quietly in the background while he fooled around. Toru didn't always understand Nagasawa, but he couldn't help admiring his confidence, even if it was often cruel. Then one day a letter arrived. It was from Naoko. She was living at a sanatorium deep in the mountains, a kind of retreat for people who had lost their way in life. She told Toru she needed time, that her heart was too fragile, but she hadn't forgotten him. Toru decided to write back, and so began a tender exchange of letters that stretched across the seasons. He told her about his days, his books, the city. She replied in soft words, filled with sadness and slow healing. One spring, Toru decided to visit her. The place where Naoko lived was like something from another world tucked away among the hills, surrounded by tall trees and quiet wind. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and time moved more slowly there. Naoko greeted him with a smile, thinner than he remembered, her long hair tied back, her eyes full of distant sorrow. He met her roommate, Reiko, a lively woman in her late 30s, who had once been a pianist but had her own difficult past. Reiko welcomed Toru warmly and talked with a sharp wit that made the air a little lighter. The three of them spent hours together, playing music, sharing stories, and watching the stars blink over the mountains. But even in those moments of peace, Naoko's sadness remained close, like a shadow that never quite left her face. She tried to smile, to laugh, but there were moments she seemed to drift away, as though she were somewhere else entirely. Toru stayed for a few days, and when it was time to leave, he promised to write. He didn't want to push her. He just wanted her to heal. Back in Tokyo, life went on, but something had shifted. Toru now lived with the soft ache of waiting for another letter. Waiting for a sign that Naoko was getting better. Then, almost like a breeze, slipping through an open window, someone new entered his life. Her name was Midori. She sat beside him in class sharp, unpredictable, bold. While everyone else seemed to fade into the background, Midori glowed with a wild kind of energy. She asked strange questions. She skipped class to visit bookstores or get drunk. She laughed loudly, talked openly about her desires, and challenged Toru at every turn. He didn't know what to make of her. She was the opposite of Naoko alive in every sense, burning with chaos and honesty. At first he kept his distance, still tangled in his feelings for Naoko, but Midori had a way of getting under his skin. They started spending more time together, visiting hospitals, climbing rooftops, sharing meals in tiny cafes, and somewhere in the middle of all that, something tender began to grow between them. But Toru didn't know how to hold both of these feelings at once, the quiet love for Naoko and the blooming one for Midori. It was like trying to balance on a wire stretched between two worlds. Midori wanted him, but she didn't want to be second choice, and Toru didn't want to hurt her. He was still writing to Naoko, still hoping, still waiting. As the days passed, he began to feel like he was standing at the edge of something. The past tugged at him like an undertow while the present waited with outstretched arms. He didn't know which way to go. Only that something had to change. Toru drifted through that summer like a man caught in a dream. Letters from Naoko came less frequently, and when they did arrive, they were filled with a kind of quiet ache, as though each word was carefully chosen to avoid unraveling her fragile balance. Still, he read them again and again, letting her voice settle over him like a warm, sad mist. He tried to keep busy. University life blurred by in a haze of lectures and small talk. His roommate, Nagasawa, was still chasing his ambitions, still charming women with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. They would go out sometimes, drinking in smoky bars or walking under neon signs, but even in those moments Toru felt like a spectator. He was there, but not entirely. Something inside him was still waiting for a sign from Naoko for the past to find a way to be okay again. Meanwhile, Midori continued to dance into his life like a sudden splash of color. She was impossible to ignore, open, sarcastic, and full of contradictions. One day she would talk about her dying father. The next, she'd be dragging Toru up a bookstore ladder to find obscure books or making him walk miles to eat curry. At her favorite place, she challenged him, teased him, pushed him, but also let him in. She showed him her mésalliances, her hurt, her laughter, her loneliness. There was something intoxicating about being around her, like being jolted back into life. And Toru, though still deeply entangled in his feelings for Naoko, found himself drawn to Midori's fire. It wasn't just attraction. It was a sense of being seen, of being needed in a way that wasn't built on sadness. Midori didn't want his pity. She wanted his full presence, his heart, his truth. But she also didn't want to compete with a ghost. There were moments when Toru thought maybe he could choose her, that maybe the future lived in her laughter and not in Naoko's silences. But then he'd think about that quiet hillside, about Reiko's songs and the way Naoko's hand had trembled in his, and he'd feel split down the middle. He visited the sanatorium again that autumn. Naoko looked different, her face thinner, her smile more fragile, but she was glad to see him. They took long walks together under golden trees, their feet crunching through fallen leaves. She spoke a little more this time, opening up about her sister, who had also taken her own life years ago. She talked about the fear that lived inside her, the strange way her thoughts twisted, and the moments when she felt like disappearing. Toru listened quietly, never judging, just being there. Reiko, as always, brought a bit of levity. She still played her guitar and told strange, sometimes heartbreaking stories from her past. She spoke about a student she once taught who had betrayed her in a way that ruined her career and her mental health. Yet somehow she had learned to laugh again, to live simply. Her resilience was something Toru didn't fully understand, but deeply respected. That visit ended like the first with a promise to write, with no clear idea of when he'd see Naoko again. But as he walked away from the mountains, a part of him wondered if he would ever really be able to help her heal, or if he was just clinging to something that was already slipping through his fingers. Back in Tokyo, winter crept in quietly. Toru wandered through the city in heavy coats, the cold seeping into his bones. He thought of Midori often. She had stopped calling. When they ran into each other at the university, there was a distance in her eyes. She had waited for him to choose, and he hadn't. Now she was slipping away, too. He wanted to tell her everything, that he didn't know what he was doing, that he was lost, that he was afraid to let go of Naoko, afraid it would mean abandoning the part of himself that still believed he could hold her up. But Midori wasn't the kind of girl you kept on a shelf, waiting. She had her own pain, her own need to be seen and loved fully. Then came the letter that shattered him. Naoko had taken her own life. The words hit him like a wave of ice. The stillness he had carried inside him, all the restraint, cracked open in an instant. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The grief came crashing down heavy and hollow. He walked for hours through the city, his steps aimless, his heart a wreck. He thought about the hillside, her voice, the way she had once reached for him in the dark. And he thought about all the things he hadn't said, hadn't done, hadn't understood until it was too late. There was a funeral, quiet and solemn. He didn't cry at first. The tears came later, in the dark when no one was watching. That's when it became real that she was gone, that he would never again receive a letter from her, never walk beside her under swaying trees, never hear her laugh that barely there laugh. Reiko wrote to him a few weeks later, her letter full of pain but also love. She told him that Naoko had fought as hard as she could, that sometimes the darkness just becomes too much. She asked him to visit her again, not for Naoko, but for himself. So he went. This time the sanatorium felt different, emptier, sadder, but Reiko was there, still strong in her own gentle, weathered way. They talked late into the night, both of them nursing their grief like old wounds. Reiko played her guitar and sang the Beatles again, her voice carrying both sorrow and comfort. They shared stories. They remembered Naoko not as a tragedy, but as a person kind, lost, beautiful, trying so hard to survive. On the last night, Reiko asked Toru to sleep beside her, not out of lust, but out of something deeply human. They made love with tenderness, like two people trying to feel alive again through the weight of all they had lost. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't complicated. It was a quiet act of connection, of sorrow shared and softened by touch. When he left the next morning, Reiko gave him her blessing. She told him to find someone who could walk beside him through the mess and beauty of life. She reminded him that he was still young, still full of love, still capable of joy. He had carried Naoko's memory for long enough. It was time to carry himself. Toru returned to the city, changed, still grieving, still unsure, but a little more open to the world again. He thought about Midori often, about the way her eyes lit up when she talked about things that mattered to her, about the way she had waited ... And for the first time in a long while, he wanted to reach for the future. The city looked the same, but Toru didn't feel like the same person anymore. Everything felt slightly quieter, like the world had lowered its voice out of respect. Grief had altered his rhythm, how he walked, how he looked at strangers, how he heard music. It didn't paralyze him, but it lingered in the corners of his mind, like the shadow of a rain cloud. He often found himself thinking about the way Naoko had smiled, about the gentleness of her hands, and the silence that always seemed to hover between them like a fragile bird. But he also began to think more clearly about the people still here, the living ones, the ones who needed him now. Reiko's parting words echoed in his ears like a soft command. Live, not just exist, not just float through lectures and lonely walks, but live. She had urged him to stop carrying Naoko like a weight that bound his feet. He would never forget her, never stop loving her in his own way, but he had to choose to step forward. And that meant facing Midori again. Their last few interactions had been strained. She had pulled away when she sensed his heart wasn't ready. She wasn't someone who waited patiently in the shadows. She was fire, loud and unpredictable, but also fiercely honest. She had given him her truth, and he hadn't known what to do with it. Toru picked up the phone and called her. The voice on the other end was cautious, unsure, but it was her. She didn't pretend like nothing had happened. She didn't make it easy, but she listened. He told her everything, not in grand speeches, but in soft, broken admissions. About Naoko, about his grief, about how long it had taken him to see clearly. He didn't beg, and he didn't promise things he couldn't mean. He just asked her to see him again. She agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, not far from the campus where it had all begun. She looked the same sharp eyes, short hair, an air of restless independence, but her expression was careful. They sat by the window and watched the afternoon light stretch across the street, and for a while neither said much. Then, slowly, their conversation began to flow. Midori didn't rush him. She didn't demand explanations or apologies. She simply wanted to know if he was here, not half present, not lost in the past, but truly with her. And Toru, for the first time, could say yes. They talked for hours that day, about books and memories and the strangeness of being alive. Midori still told outrageous stories, still swore too much, still called him out when he got too quiet. But there was something softer in her now, too, something that came from knowing how close she had come to losing him. After that day, their time together began to rebuild slowly, cautiously, like a house being reconstructed after a storm. Toru didn't pretend to have all the answers. There were still days when he felt hollow, when he woke up with the weight of Naoko's absence pressing against his chest. But he didn't hide that from Midori. He shared it with her, and she didn't flinch. They began to walk through the city together again, like they used to before the silence. They laughed more. They fought sometimes, too, usually because Toru would retreat into his thoughts, and Midori would call him out for disappearing. But their connection grew not because it was perfect, but because it was real. One night, as they sat on a rooftop watching the lights of Tokyo flicker below, Midori leaned into him, whispered, "Do you love me?" It wasn't a question designed to trap him or test him. It was simple, honest, ... And Toru, feeling the night air on his face and her warmth beside him, said yes. He didn't say it like someone reciting poetry. He said it like someone who had lost and learned and healed enough to mean it. Not in spite of the past, but because of it. Still, life wasn't a straight road. There were days when Toru felt lost, when memories came crashing back, like sudden waves. There were moments when he'd hear a song or see a flash of dark hair and think of Naoko, and his breath would catch. But he no longer ran from those moments. He let them come and go like clouds drifting across the sky. He would still write sometimes letters he never sent, lines in a notebook that no one else would read. It helped him make peace with things. And now, with Midori at his side, he had someone who didn't try to erase his past or fix him, but simply walked beside him with fierce loyalty. There were nights when they would stay up late, drinking cheap wine and talking about death and love and what it meant to be human. Midori always had some wild theory or a sarcastic remark to throw in. And Toru, who had once spent so much time wrapped in silence, found himself laughing again, really laughing. He realized something then, that life was never going to be clean or easy. That pain would never fully leave him. But that love, real love, wasn't about pretending the pain wasn't there. It was about finding someone willing to sit with you in it. Someone who said, Yes, I see your scars, and I'm still here. The seasons turned again. Winter faded. Spring returned with its soft winds and cherry blossoms blooming like pink confetti across the city. Students filled the streets with energy and laughter. The world kept spinning. Toru walked through it all with steadier steps. There was a kind of peace in the quietness that settled over Toru's life, though it wasn't the kind of peace without pain. It was more like a soft light that filtered through the cracks, warming the broken pieces rather than fixing them. He had learned that grief doesn't leave, it changes shape, and love, too, doesn't erase the past. It weaves itself around it, tenderly, patiently. With Midori, things weren't always easy. She was sharp and direct, unafraid to challenge him when he drifted into silence. But that was what he needed. She didn't let him vanish into memory. She tugged him back to the present with her laughter, her stubbornness, and her unwavering presence. And he, in turn, learned how to show up fully, not just in words, but in action. It was the kind of love that grew slowly, like roots twisting deep into the earth, holding them steady. Sometimes they would walk through the park, not speaking, just sharing the same space, breathing the same air. Torish would catch a glimpse of pink petals falling and feel a quiet ache for everything that had passed, for Kazuki's sudden absence, for Naoko's long suffering, for the parts of himself he'd had to leave behind. But he didn't resist those feelings. He let them rise and settle, like the changing of tides. One evening, as they sat by the river watching the lanterns float downstream, Midori turned to him and asked, "Where are you now?" It was a question that might have once rattled him, but not any more. "I'm here," he said softly. "With you?" It wasn't a grand declaration. It was simple and true. He had spent so long lost in memory, caught between what was and what might have been. Now, finally, he had returned to the present, to the life unfolding before him. Reiko wrote to him again. Her letter was warm and thoughtful, filled with updates about her slow progress back into the world. She had finally left the sanatorium and was staying with relatives, playing music again, helping children learn the piano. She told him she still thought of Naoko often, but not with pain anymore. "I think," she wrote, "she's part of the music now." Toru read that line again, and again, part of the music. And maybe that was it. Maybe everyone he had lost, their voices, their smiles, their unfinished sentences, had become a kind of background music to his life. Always there, but softer now. Not ghosts haunting him, but gentle reminders of how deeply he had felt, how much he had survived. University ended. The protests faded. Friends drifted apart. The world shifted in small ways, like clouds changing shape. But Toru stayed grounded. He didn't rush into the future. He took it slowly, one step, one morning, one cup of tea at a time. Midori stayed with him through it all. There were fights, misunderstandings, moments of fear and closeness. But through every rough patch, they kept choosing each other. They built a life not based on perfection, but on understanding, a life with room for both sadness and laughter. Sometimes Toru would wake up in the middle of the night, the hum of the city outside the window, and just lie there grateful, not because everything made sense, but because he had learned how to live with the questions, because he had found someone who didn't need answers to stay. And on certain days when the breeze carried just the right scent or a melody played faintly in a passing cafe, he would think of Naoko. Not with guilt, not with regret, just love. She had been part of his story, a chapter filled with beauty and sorrow, softness and pain. He didn't want to forget it, but he no longer lived inside it. He had stepped out of that quiet forest and returned to the world changed, but whole. The song Norwegian Wood would still come on sometimes, and when it did, Toru didn't turn away. He listened. Let the notes rise and fall like waves. Let the memory pass through him like a breeze through open windows. And then, gently, he would take Midori's hand and walk forward, together. Thanks for listening to this gentle journey through Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. If this story moved you, helped you reflect, or simply kept you company, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another book summary.